Hey guys, tonight we're sinking into something a little quieter than battles and banners. The silence that comes after the war. So, find a cozy spot, dim whatever light you forgot to turn off, and let's wander slowly through the long, strange afterlives of women who went to war, and then disappeared from the story. Because when we talk about soldiers, the pictures in our heads are always the same. Uniforms, medals, men with chiseled jaws staring heroically into a smoky horizon. But history is full of women who fought too. They drove trucks, carried rifles, patched up half-dead soldiers, spied, sabotaged, and sometimes just picked up a gun because the front line was now their backyard. And then, when the guns went quiet, most of them went home, or tried to. And that's the awkward part. Because the same societies that had begged them to fight didn't really know what to do with them afterward. You can almost hear the collective shrug. Thanks for the help. Now kindly disappear. So tonight we're going to drift through that disappearing act. Slowly, gently, without any explosions or dramatic sound effects. Just quiet disillusionment, broken promises, and some very uncomfortable post-war tea parties. The strange case of the forgotten front line. Let's start with the obvious. Women didn't just show up in war because they felt adventurous. They were drafted by necessity. Every single time. When nations start running out of men, they suddenly remember that women exist, and actually might be useful. World War II is the clearest example. By 1943, Britain was running on fumes. Factories needed workers, the army needed clerks, the resistance needed couriers, and the Red Army needed anyone who could hold a rifle without crying. So they called in the women. And to everyone's mild surprise, they didn't just do the jobs, they excelled at them. The Soviets had entire regiments of female snipers, like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who calmly took down over 300 enemy soldiers. Before being pulled off the front line to go on a propaganda tour in the US, imagine being that good at your job and then being told to go smile for journalists because it looks better. British women joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, flying planes as part of the Air Transport Auxiliary, ferrying Spitfires from factories to bases. American women joined the Women's Army Corps and resistance. Networks from France to Poland were practically held together, with female couriers who could pass through checkpoints without suspicion. But when the war ended, it was as if someone snapped their fingers and said, "All right, ladies, time to go back to peeling potatoes." Because post-war society wasn't built for women who had seen too much, done too much, or, heaven forbid, had become competent. The Soviet Union. Equality. But not really. Let's float eastward for a moment to the Soviet Union, the self-proclaimed land of equality, or at least equality when it was convenient. During the war, the USSR recruited roughly 800,000 women into direct military service. That's pilots, machine gunners, tank drivers, medics, partisans, even snipers. For a brief, brutal few years, gender equality was achieved through sheer desperation. But the moment victory was declared in 1945, all that faded faster than Stalin's mustache could bristle. Most of these women were told to go home, marry, and start producing the next generation of heroes. Because apparently, the one they already were didn't count. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, our 300-kill sniper, ended up working as a historian. She lived quietly, lecturing, rarely talking about her wartime experiences. And why would she? Every time a veterans event came up, she was surrounded by men who treated her like an awkward curiosity. There's something profoundly Soviet about that. Heroic in theory, invisible in practice. Other women faced worse. Many were harassed or ostracized by their own comrades after demobilization. Rumors spread that women at the front had been loose, because of course they did. Nothing says thank you for saving the motherland like social slut-shaming. And to make things even more surreal, Soviet propaganda just quietly edited most of them out. War memorials went up across the USSR, but they almost always showed men. The female soldiers had simply vanished, replaced by the idea of the motherland, the eternal woman who stays home, waiting. It's a neat trick, really. You turn the real women who fought into a symbol of femininity and patience, and then pretend that was the plan all along. Britain. The great, thanks now go home. Meanwhile, in Britain, things were slightly more polite, but not much better. By 1945, around 450,000 women had served in the armed forces, in roles ranging from mechanics to radar operators. And then came victory, and along with it, the most British thing imaginable. Quiet dismissal wrapped in polite gratitude. The Auxiliary Territorial Service, the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, all started shutting down. Women were demobilized by the thousands. They were thanked, of course, in that perfunctory way people thank you when they want you to leave a party. The government told them they could return to their essential role in rebuilding domestic life. Because naturally, after helping win a global war, the logical next step was laundry. One ex-WAF mechanic later recalled the weird whiplash of it all. She said, "One day I was fixing aircraft engines. The next I was expected to be impressed by someone's new washing machine." It's hard to say what's more British, the understatement, or the complete institutional amnesia that followed. Even worse, many women were legally barred from continuing in technical jobs they'd mastered during the war. Post-war labor laws prioritized men returning from service. So you could be a trained aircraft engineer in 1944 and a shop clerk in 1946, because, well, that's just how society recalibrated. There was this unspoken sense that the whole wartime equality thing had been a sort of fever dream, something that happened under duress, like rationing or bombing raids. And when the world stabilized, the old order quietly resumed its place. A little more dented, but largely intact. America. Rosie packs her lunchbox and leaves now. Across the Atlantic, the American experience was a slightly different flavor of the same dish. You probably know Rosie the Riveter, the poster girl for wartime womanhood. You know, flexing her arm, scarf on her head, saying, "We can do it!" And she did. Millions of women joined the workforce during World War II. Over 6 million, in fact. Many worked in defense industries. Others joined the Women's Army Corps, the Navy Waves, or the WASPs, Women Air Force Service Pilots. They kept factories humming, drove ambulances, handled communications, even flew test planes. And then, just as the US was celebrating victory, the government gently encouraged them to stop existing professionally. The propaganda machine that had been so eager to promote Rosie now switched gears entirely. Suddenly, magazines were full of smiling women holding babies again. Headlines read things like, "Home again and happy," because apparently, nothing says victory like surrendering your independence. Many women wanted to keep working, of course. Some did, especially those without husbands or those who developed a taste for financial autonomy. But post-war America was in the mood for suburbs, stability, and gender roles wrapped in pastel colors. And for the women who had served abroad, in the WACs, Waves, or Army Nurse Corps, the return to civilian life was even stranger. Some were quietly proud, but many just didn't talk about it, because people didn't really want to hear it. There was this unspoken discomfort around women who'd been out there, especially those who'd served overseas. It didn't fit the national bedtime story of the 1950s. So, their uniforms went into trunks, and their stories went into silence. Let's drift back a bit. Women warriors before it was cool now. If we float further back in time, way before the World Wars, this whole pattern starts to look less like an accident and more like a historical habit. Every time women fought, society developed immediate selective amnesia afterward. It's like a magic trick. One moment they're heroes, the next, they've been politely erased. Take Deborah Sampson, for example. The woman who disguised herself as a man to fight in the American Revolution. She literally joined under the name Robert Shirtliff, fought for over a year, got injured, and still managed to keep her cover. When she was finally discovered, she didn't get jail time, which is impressive. But her pension took decades to be approved. Because you know, she was technically not supposed to be there. Or Hannah Snell, the British Marine who did something similar in the 1740s. She fought, got wounded, came home, revealed her identity, and was briefly celebrated as a novelty. Then she spent her later years running a pub and slowly fading into obscurity. Because apparently, there's only so much society can handle when a woman with a musket gets famous. Even in earlier centuries, you find the same theme. Women picked up arms during crises, peasants' revolts, civil wars, invasions, and were then told to go home the moment peace returned. Because peace always came with paperwork, and paperwork didn't have a column for woman who defied gender expectations. The double standard of heroism. There's also a fascinating double standard in how we remember male and female soldiers. Men come home from war and are often described as haunted, changed, or hardened. Women come home and are called damaged or unfeminine. Same trauma, different packaging. In the Soviet Union, women veterans who'd survived frontline combat were sometimes refused marriage. Men didn't want wives who had seen too much. In France, female resistance fighters were celebrated briefly after liberation, but many faced social backlash for stepping outside their roles. And in Japan, The few women who served as nurses near front lines were often treated as morally suspect afterward, as if war itself were somehow contagious. It's almost like history couldn't handle the idea of women being both strong and ordinary afterward. They had to either be saints or scandals, nothing in between, so in most cases, they were quietly filed away under temporary wartime measures, like blackout curtains or ration books. The quiet fade into domesticity. By the late 1940s, across most of the world, the return to normal life was in full swing. Men came home, economies restarted, and domestic life became the new battlefield. The advertising industry made sure of that, selling washing machines as medals of honor. But for many women who'd served, that normal life didn't quite fit anymore. They'd seen the world, dealt with death, handled logistics, command, machinery, things you don't just unlearn. Some slipped back into family life seamlessly. Others found the walls of post-war domesticity strangely tight. There were quiet depressions, unspoken regrets, and the occasional memoir decades later, written by a grandmother who finally decided she could tell the truth. That's the bittersweet thing about post-war silence. It's not always imposed from the outside. Sometimes people simply stop talking because it hurts. Too much to remember. And that's where we'll pause for tonight. At the uneasy peace of 1946, where the world tried very hard to forget that it had ever needed women to fight. Because forgetting makes everyone feel tidy again. But we're not done yet. Next time, we'll drift through part 2, where we'll visit the underground worlds of female spies, nurses, and resistance fighters. The ones who didn't quite go home quietly, and the ones history almost lost completely. So for now, close your eyes, let the last echoes of the marching boots fade, and imagine the quiet streets after the victory parade, where the war is over, but the silence has only just begun. Hey again, if you're still awake, which would be a minor miracle at this pace, we're now going to slip quietly into the shadowy world of women who didn't just pick up uniforms, but identities. The female spies, couriers, and resistance members who lived double lives, and often, no lives at all after peace returned. Because espionage is glamorous in the movies, but in real life, it's mostly waiting, hunger, and wondering if your code name will be on tomorrow's list of captured and executed. And yet, thousands of women across Europe signed up for exactly that. Let's start with one of the better-known, but still underappreciated ones. Violette Sabo. Half French, half English, full chaos energy. She joined Britain's Special Operations Executive, the SOE, at just 22. Her job? Parachute into occupied France, organize sabotage, and not get caught. She managed 2 missions before being captured by the Germans in 1944 and executed at Ravensbrück concentration camp. After the war, she was posthumously awarded the George Cross, which is British for "we feel bad, but we can't actually undo death." Her daughter grew up reading her mother's file, because that was all that was left of her. Then there's Nancy Wake, nicknamed the White Mouse, because she was impossible to catch. A New Zealand-born journalist turned resistance operative. She ran safe houses, blew up supply routes, and generally irritated the Gestapo so much they put a huge bounty on her head. She survived the war, lived into her 90s, and once said she only regretted not killing more Nazis. A sentiment that, frankly, ages quite well. And Odette Sansom, another SOE agent, tortured, imprisoned, survived Ravensbrück, and later testified at war crimes trials. When asked how she endured the pain, she said something very British like, "I decided they could have my body, but not my mind." You can almost hear the teacup clink. After the war, these women came home to parades and medals, briefly. Then, as the years rolled by, the cameras moved on, and they turned into quiet old ladies with secrets no one wanted to ask about. Because post-war society didn't quite know what to do with women who had strangled guards with piano wire. Some became memoirists. Others married, changed names, and tried to blend into suburbia. Odette worked for the British Film Board. Violette's story became a film. Nancy eventually retired in Australia, where she complained with perfect dryness that the Australians don't know how to drink properly. You have to respect that energy. The women who vanished twice, and then there were the nameless ones. Hundreds of local resistance women across France, Poland, Belgium, who were caught, killed, or simply never recorded. They didn't have medals or state funerals. Their reward was anonymity. A French historian once said, "The female resistance fighter is the only soldier expected to disappear twice. Once into secrecy, and once into silence." It's an eerily accurate line. First, they had to hide from the enemy. Later, they had to hide from memory. Many of these women were betrayed by their own neighbors, tortured, deported to camps, and then posthumously forgotten. France, in particular, did a strange balancing act. It glorified the male maquisard, but treated many female resistors as minor side notes, because apparently, you can fight fascism, but you can't fight patriarchy. The nurses and the aftermath of caring. Too much meanwhile, another army of women fought without weapons. The nurses. Millions of them in every theater of war. Their front lines were hospital tents, field stations, and prison camps. And if you think that sounds less terrifying, you've probably never tried treating gangrene under shell fire. In World War I, nurses like Edith Cavell became martyrs. She saved lives on both sides and was executed by the Germans for it. Her last words were, "Patriotism is not enough," which is both profound and deeply inconvenient for governments that thrive on patriotism. By World War II, nursing had become more organized, but no less brutal. The Japanese invasion of the Philippines left scores of American and Filipino nurses trapped for years, the so-called Angels of Bataan. They worked in jungle hospitals with almost no supplies, contracting malaria while pretending everything was fine. After liberation, most were sent home with minimal recognition and instructions to rest and recover. Because trauma wasn't a concept yet, just nerves. The British, American and Soviet nurses fared slightly better, in the sense that they got uniforms, pay, and better rations. But once demobilized, they returned to the same narrow world. Thank you for your service. Please marry a dentist. The irony is that many nurses had seen more of war's reality than any general, but that experience made them both invaluable and, paradoxically, socially radioactive. No one likes dinner conversation about maggot therapy, so they just stop talking about it. War ends on paper. In real life, it ends very, very slowly. For female veterans, the post-war years were a strange limbo. Half pride, half invisibility. Some tried to join veterans associations, only to be told they didn't qualify because their service didn't count. Which is bureaucratic poetry if you think about it. In the US, for example, the WASPs, the women who ferried aircraft, weren't even recognized as military veterans until 1977. That's 3 decades of official thanks but no thanks. They had flown everything from B-17s to fighter planes, sometimes without proper navigation gear, and then were told their records were classified, mostly to prevent men from feeling awkward about it. In the Soviet Union, many women veterans spent their lives pretending they hadn't served at all, because being a frontline soldier wasn't exactly an asset in the marriage market. A former medic once said that after she came home she burned her uniform in the garden, not out of shame, but exhaustion. In post-war Japan, the women who had served as nurses or in auxiliary roles had it even worse. Occupation authorities dissolved their organizations. Those who'd treated soldiers at the front were often rumored to have been comfort women, regardless of truth. So, they kept silent, because silence at least was safe. Even the women who had only worked in factories experienced a strange kind of whiplash. They'd tasted independence, then had it confiscated. Their wages dropped, their jobs disappeared, and advertisements cheerfully reminded them that true happiness was found in dishwashing liquid. The psychological impact wasn't written about until decades later, but it shows up in diaries, letters, and small, brittle sentences like, "I feel I have been put away." That one line sums up the entire post-war experience for millions. Part 4. The Cold War and the Myth of Progress. By the 1950s, the world had new enemies, new uniforms, and chained briefly now, new excuses for letting women work again. The Cold War created another surge in female military roles, though still wrapped in sexism and propaganda. In the Soviet bloc, women were once again paraded as symbols of equality. Look how progressive we are. But in practice, the good positions went to men, and the female veterans of World War II were trotted out for parades, then forgotten until the next anniversary. It's like being a living museum exhibit that only opens on Victory Day. In America, things got even more paradoxical. Women were allowed into the new integrated services, the WACs, Waves, and later, the Women's Army Corps became part of the regular army. But they were capped at 2% of total strength, and usually barred from combat. So, basically, progress with an asterisk. The U.S. Air Force celebrated a handful of female pilots, but still refused to let them fly missions. The Army offered secretarial officer training programs, which is like being promoted from invisible to translucent. And yet, despite the restrictions, the groundwork was quietly being laid. When the Vietnam War began, Thousands of women, mostly nurses, served again, this time with slightly better pay and slightly worse mental health outcomes. The irony is, these women were often the first to see the cracks in the patriotic narrative. They saw the wounded, the trauma, the waste, and came home disillusioned. But while male veterans were given at least some space to rage, women were told to smile and move on. Society's emotional bandwidth, it turns out, has always been gendered. Part 5. Rediscovery and late recognition. It took decades for anyone to notice that half of war's labor force had gone missing from the historical record. The rediscovery began quietly in the 1970s, when feminist historians started asking annoying questions like, "Where did all the women go?" Memoirs began surfacing. Old trunks were opened, letters reread, uniforms unfolded from mothballs. Some of the first oral histories of female veterans were heartbreaking, not because of tragedy, but because of their mildness. Women describing extraordinary experiences in the same tone one might use to explain a soup recipe. One Soviet sniper said simply, "We were told to forget, so we did," until someone asked. Governments began issuing late honors, medals, pensions, honorary veteran status. It was nice, in a belated kind of way, but it also underscored how little the world had changed, because nothing says equality like being thanked 40 years too late. In the UK, memorials to the auxiliary services were finally built. In the US, the WASP pilots got full recognition in the Carter era, and in Russia, the last surviving female snipers appeared on television interviews. Tiny old ladies with medals, describing night operations in voices barely above a whisper. It's oddly poetic. The same calm tone they'd used in life, finally recorded before it vanished forever. Part 6. The stories beneath the silence as we drift further into the 21st century. More of these stories are finally resurfacing, through archives, documentaries, and the occasional historian who gets lost in a filing cabinet for a decade. What emerges is a kind of collective melancholy. The women weren't erased by accident. They were erased because their existence complicated the narrative. Wars are supposed to reaffirm order. Men fight, women wait. When women fight, that logic collapses, so history quietly tidied it up. And yet, in small ways, the memory survived. Family stories, whispered anecdotes, an old photo of a grandmother in uniform that no one quite explained. Those tiny fragments have become the foundation for a new kind of history. One that finally lets these women exist, not as exceptions, but as participants. Modern militaries now cite them as trailblazers. Though, in a very modern irony, gender discrimination still exists. It turns out, progress moves about as fast as a tank in mud. Part 7. Epilogue. The sound. After the parade. So here we are, at the end of our long, quiet drift through forgotten heroism. The wars have ended, the uniforms are gone, the medals tarnished, and yet, something lingers. Not glory, not bitterness, just a kind of steady hum. The background noise of history's unfinished business. When we ask, what happened to female soldiers after the war? The answer is both simple and sad. They went home. They got jobs or didn't. They married or didn't. They lived entire lives half remembered, half erased. But history, inconveniently, never really forgets. It just naps. And every so often, someone opens an archive, dusts off a file, and a name resurfaces. A quiet ripple of recognition for someone who once crossed a battlefield and then spent 60 years pretending she hadn't. So, tonight, as we let this story fade, imagine them not as ghosts or martyrs, but as ordinary women who did extraordinary things, and then made dinner afterward. Because that's what most history actually is. Bravery, followed by laundry, and maybe that's exactly how they'd want to be remembered. Not as symbols or saints, but as people who did what needed to be done, then got on with it. So close your eyes. Let the parades dissolve, the uniforms fold themselves away, and the world, at least for a little while, fall quiet again.